The dust of the Wyoming Territory settled on everything, a fine, pale powder that coated the hem of Evangeline Hartwell's traveling dress and muted the deep blue of its silk. It was a dress for a wedding, for a new life, purchased with hope in the bustling city of Boston. Here, under the vast, indifferent sky, it seemed a foolish extravagance. The steam locomotive had hissed its departure hours ago, its smoke a quickly dissolving smudge against the horizon, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like a weight upon her chest. Willow Creek Station was little more than a wooden platform, a small office, and a water tower that stood like a lonely sentinel over the endless plains. Evangeline sat on her trunk, the last passenger, a solitary figure in a sea of sagebrush and sun-bleached grass. She had clutched the telegram in her gloved hand for so long the paper had grown soft and fragile. Arrive October 12th. Oh, my love, Joshua. Today was October 12th. The sun, once high and warm with promise, had begun its slow descent, painting the western clouds in hues of bruised purple and melancholic orange. Every distant cloud of dust on the horizon sent a flutter through her heart, a surge of desperate hope that quickly curdled into disappointment. It was only the wind, her constant, sighing companion. She had pictured this moment for months. Joshua Whitmore, her fiancé, his face weathered and handsome from his work establishing their future homestead, would ride into view. He would swing down from his horse, his familiar grin erasing the months of separation. He would lift her into his arms, and the lonely expanse of Willow Creek would transform into the threshold of their shared world. But the path from the station remained empty. The shadows of the water tower and the small office stretched long and skeletal across the cracked earth, reaching for her. Doubt, a seed planted hours ago, had taken root and was now a thorny vine constricting her throat. What if he had been delayed? An accident, perhaps? A lost horse? Her mind, a frantic cartographer, drew maps of disaster, each one more terrifying than the last. But beneath the fear of circumstance lay a colder, more insidious dread, the fear of intent. What if he simply was not coming? The thought was a betrayal to the love she had nurtured through carefully worded letters, a profanity against the future she had so meticulously constructed in her heart. She smoothed the fabric of her dress, the gesture automatic, a small attempt to restore an order that was rapidly unraveling. The air grew colder, and with the chill came the scent of dust and distant rain, a mournful perfume for a day that was dying without ceremony. The vastness of the land, which had seemed a canvas for their future, now felt like a cage, its horizons infinite and inescapable. She was a single, misplaced stitch in an enormous, rugged tapestry, and she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. In the dim light of the Willow Creek mercantile, Nathaniel Garrison listened more than he spoke. It was a habit that served him well. Men's words were often just noise, but the quiet spaces between them held the truth. He stood by the counter, a bag of flour and tins of coffee at his feet, while the station master, Elias Cobb, recounted the day's notable event to anyone who would listen. "Fine thing, she is," Elias said, shaking his head. "Dressed like she's going to a governor's ball. Been sitting out there since the noon train. Said she's waiting on Joshua Whitmore." A cynical chuckle rumbled from one of the men leaning against a pickle barrel. "Whitmore? He pulled up stakes a week ago. Heard he sold his claim for a song and lit out for the gold fields in the Dakotas. Took a saloon girl with him, or so the story goes." The men laughed, a coarse, thoughtless sound. Nate's jaw tightened. He knew of Whitmore, a man of easy promises and shifting allegiances, his ambition always outstripping his integrity. Nate paid for his supplies, his movements deliberate and unhurried, but a cold knot of something akin to anger had formed in his gut. He thought of the woman Elias described, sitting alone on the platform, clad in the uniform of a future that had already been stolen from her. He imagined her hope, bright and fragile as a robin's egg, slowly cracking as the day wore on. It was not his concern. The West was littered with broken promises and abandoned dreams. It was the nature of the place, and yet he could not shake the image. He gave a curt nod to the store owner and walked out into the falling dusk, the bell above the door jangling in his wake. He loaded his supplies onto his pack horse, his mind a quiet battleground. He had his own ranch to run, his own hardships to bear. He was not a man given to charity or interference. His life was a closed loop of hard work, solitude, and the turning of the seasons. To step into another's chaos was to invite it into his own. But the thought of leaving her there, a beacon of misplaced faith for the coyotes and the biting wind, chafed at a sense of decency he rarely had cause to examine. With a low sigh that plumed in the cold air, he swung himself into his saddle. He did not turn toward home. He turned toward the station. The ride was quiet, the rhythmic beat of his horse's hooves on the dry road the only sound. The land was stark in the gloaming, its beauty harsh and uncompromising. It demanded resilience. It did not suffer fools or the unprepared. As the station came into view, he saw her, just as Elias had described, a silhouette against the fading light, small and still, seated on her luggage as if she were a queen presiding over a kingdom of desolation. The sound of hoofbeats, slow and steady, finally broke the spell of the encroaching night. Evangeline's head snapped up, her heart giving a painful, hopeful leap. But it was not the swift, eager approach she had imagined. This was a single rider, his pace measured, almost reluctant. As he drew closer, she saw he was a stranger, tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, with a hat pulled low against the twilight. He stopped his horse a respectful distance away, not dismounting immediately, as if giving her a moment to compose herself. His presence was solid, earthy, a stark contrast to the ethereal memory of Joshua. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low baritone, as steady and plain as the land around them. "You are Miss Hartwell." Evangeline rose, her legs stiff, her dignity a tattered cloak she pulled tight around her. "I am. And you are?" "Nathaniel Garrison." He swung down from his horse, his movements economical and sure. He did not offer a smile or any false comfort. His gaze was direct, his expression unreadable but for a deep seriousness in his eyes. "I'm afraid I bring you ill news. Joshua Whitmore, he is not in Willow Creek. He left the territory some days ago." He delivered the words like a physician delivering a fatal diagnosis, without flourish, without sentiment, allowing the stark truth to do its own brutal work. The world, which had been tilting for hours, finally capsized. The breath left her body in a silent gasp. She sank back down onto her trunk, the last of her strength deserting her. The stranger's words were not a possibility to be feared. They were a fact, solid and unmovable as the mountains on the horizon. Abandoned. The word echoed in the sudden, roaring silence of her mind. She had been left. A parcel mailed to an address that no longer existed. She felt a flush of heat crawl up her neck, the profound, burning shame of being unwanted. Mr. Garrison stood in silence, allowing her the dignity of her grief. He did not patronize her with platitudes. When she finally looked up, her eyes blurred with unshed tears, he spoke again, his tone still practical. "You cannot stay here. The night train does not run east until Friday. The hotel in town, it is not a suitable place for a lady alone." He was right. She had only a few dollars, meant for small comforts, not for survival. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her shock. What was she to do? Where was she to go? "I have a ranch north of here," he continued, as if laying out the terms of a business transaction. "It is a quiet place. I have need of a housekeeper, someone to cook and keep things in order. The work is honest. I will provide room and board and a small wage. It would give you a place to stay until you can make other arrangements." The offer hung in the air between them, a lifeline thrown into the wreckage of her life. It was not charity, she understood that. It was a proposition, a job. Her pride recoiled. She was Evangeline Hartwell of Boston, a lady of good family, soon to be a wife. She was not a domestic servant. But that woman, she realized with a sickening lurch, no longer existed. That woman had vanished with the noon train and Joshua's empty promises. In her place was a destitute stranger in a foreign land. She looked at his face, weathered by sun and wind, at his hands, calloused and capable, resting on his saddle. There was no pity in his eyes, but there was something else, a quiet, steady resolve. He was offering her a chance not to be saved, but to save herself. Her voice, when it came, was a reedy whisper. I accept. The journey to Nathaniel Garrison's ranch was a silent, spectral passage through the night. Evangeline rode the spare horse, her trunk strapped securely behind Nate's saddle. The moon had risen, a sliver of bone-white light that did little to illuminate the vast, shadowy landscape. The world had been reduced to the rhythmic plodding of the horses, the creak of leather, and the immense, star-dusted canopy above. The land felt alive in a way that was both beautiful and terrifying, full of unseen things that rustled in the sagebrush and called out with mournful cries. She felt infinitesimally small, a speck of human sorrow adrift in an ocean of wilderness. She had left one life behind in Boston, and the one she had come to find had vanished before she arrived. Now, she was riding toward a third, a life unimaginable just that morning, with a man whose name she had only just learned. He rode ahead of her, a solid, reassuring silhouette against the stars. He did not speak, and she was grateful for the silence. Words would have been an intrusion, a flimsy attempt to bridge the chasm of circumstance that separated them. His silence was a form of respect, an acknowledgement that her grief was a private country into which he had no right to trespass. After what felt like an eternity, a faint light appeared in the distance. As they drew closer, it resolved into the warm, yellow glow of a lamp in a window. The ranch was a collection of dark, solid shapes, a long, low-built house, a large barn, and several corrals. It was an outpost of human endeavor carved from the wild, smelling of hay, earth, and wood smoke. Nate dismounted and helped her down, his hand briefly closing over hers. His touch was firm, impersonal. It was the first human contact she'd had all day, and she felt a tremor pass through her. He led her into the house. The main room was large and sparsely furnished, dominated by a great stone fireplace where embers still glowed. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A bookshelf, filled with worn volumes, lined one wall. It was a man's space, functional, uncluttered, and deeply, profoundly quiet. "Your room is this way," he said, picking up the lamp. He led her to a small, clean room at the back of the house. It contained a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a small chest of drawers, and a washstand with a basin and pitcher. It was monastic in its simplicity, but the air was clean, and the window looked out not toward the vast, intimidating plains, but into a small, fenced-off area that might one day be a garden. "The well is out back. I'll bring your trunk in. I rise before the sun. You'll find what you need for breakfast in the larder." He set the lamp on the chest of drawers and turned to leave, pausing in the doorway. "Rest, Miss Hartwell." And then he was gone, his footsteps receding down the hall. Evangeline stood alone in the lamplight, the silence of the house settling around her. She ran a hand over the rough-hewn wood of the wall. This was her new reality. The fine blue dress felt like a costume from another play. She was no longer a bride-in-waiting. She was a housekeeper, an employee. She unlaced her boots, her fingers clumsy with exhaustion. She did not cry. The tears were frozen somewhere deep inside her, a glacier of shock and humiliation. She simply lay down on the bed, still in her traveling clothes, and stared into the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house and the lonely cry of the wind outside her window. It was the sound of survival. The first weeks at the Garrison Ranch passed in a haze of labor and exhaustion. Evangeline learned the rhythms of this new life, a cadence set by the rising and setting of the sun, not the ticking of a parlor clock. Nate was, as he had promised, gone before dawn. She would wake to the smell of coffee he'd already brewed, a silent offering left on the cooling stove before he headed out to the far reaches of his property. Her world shrank to the confines of the house and the small yard around it. She scrubbed floors, mended Nate's rough work shirts with fingers that were slowly losing their softness, and learned to cook on the cast iron stove. The work was demanding, physical, and utterly humbling. There were days her back ached so fiercely she could barely stand, days her hands, raw and chapped, stung with every touch. But the labor was also a strange sort of balm. It occupied her mind, leaving little room for the corrosive thoughts of Joshua and her public humiliation. Each loaf of bread that rose correctly, each clean-swept floor, was a small, tangible victory against the chaos that had consumed her. She was earning her keep. She was not a charity case. This thought became her mantra, the central pillar of her new, fragile identity. The silence between her and Nate persisted, but its quality began to change. Initially, it had been a gulf of awkwardness and circumstance. Now, it was evolving into a shared space, a quiet understanding that required no words. They ate their evening meals together at the plain wooden table. He would come in from the fields, streaked with dust and weary to the bone, and wash at the basin by the door. She would set out plates of stew or roasted meat, and they would eat while the lamplight cast long shadows on the walls. He never spoke of her past, and she never asked about his. He was a man defined by his actions, not his history. She began to observe him, to piece together the man from the small details of his life. She saw the way he gentled a nervous colt in the corral, his voice low and soothing. She saw the worn copy of Shakespeare on his bookshelf, its pages soft with use. She saw the deep lines of fatigue around his eyes at the end of a long day, and the quiet satisfaction on his face as he surveyed his land from the porch. He was a man tethered to the earth, his life a testament to endurance and quiet strength. One afternoon, struggling to draw water from the deep well, the rope slipped, burning her palms. She bit back a cry of pain and frustration. That evening, as she was kneading dough, Nate entered the kitchen. Without a word, he went back outside and returned with a small tin of salve. He sat on the table beside her. "For your hands," he said, his voice gruff, almost embarrassed. He left the room before she could thank him. Later, smoothing the cooling balm over her raw skin, Evangeline felt a crack in the glacier of her grief. It was not pity he had shown her. It was consideration. A simple, practical act of kindness that acknowledged her struggle without diminishing her. That night, for the first time in a long time, she looked out her window not at a prison, but the vast star-strewn sky, and felt not terror, but a strange and quiet awe. The storm arrived without preamble, a sudden, violent assault on the placid rhythm of their lives. One afternoon, the sky, which had been a serene blue, turned a bruised, greenish-gray. The wind began to keen like a mourner, whipping dust and leaves into frantic spirals. Nate came in from the barn early, his face grim. "It's a bad one," he said, his voice taut with urgency. "Check the windows." I'll see to the stock. The world outside the ranch house dissolved into a maelstrom of wind and rain. The rain came not in drops, but in solid, driving sheets that hammered against the roof and walls. The house, which had felt so solid, seemed to groan under the assault. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound so loud it felt as if the sky were splitting apart. Evangeline moved through the house, securing latches and stuffing rags under the door to keep the water from seeping in. Fear, a cold and familiar companion, prickled at her skin. But this was a different kind of fear. It was not the personal, humiliating fear of abandonment, but a primal fear shared with the man who was now outside, fighting to protect his livelihood from the fury of the elements. She found herself watching the door, waiting for his return, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. He finally burst back inside, soaked to the skin, his hair plastered to his forehead. He slammed the door against a gust of wind that threatened to rip it from its hinges. "The barn's holding," he breathed, shaking water from his hat. Just then, a loud crack echoed from above, followed by the steady drip, drip, drip of water in the corner of the main room. A leak. Nate swore under his breath and grabbed a bucket. He placed it under the leak, but the stream of water was too steady. "I have to get up there," he said, his eyes scanning the ceiling. It could bring the whole roof down if a beam gets soaked in this. Evangeline's voice was sharp with alarm. It's too dangerous. More dangerous to let it go. He disappeared into his room and returned with a coil of rope. He looked at her, his expression serious. I'll need you to hold the lamp. And keep your eyes on me. They worked as a team, their movements synchronized by the urgency of the moment. She held the lamp high, its light a small, defiant circle against the raging dark, as he climbed onto a chair and then hoisted himself into the small attic space. The wind howled and the house trembled, but her hand holding the lamp was steady. She could hear him moving above, shifting things, his grunts of effort punctuated by the relentless drumming of the rain. Water dripped on her face, mingling with the sweat of fear. After what felt like an age, the dripping slowed to a trickle, then stopped. He lowered himself back down, covered in dust and cobwebs, a long scratch on his forearm. He stood before her, breathing heavily, and for a moment, they were just two people in a small, lamplit space, holding back the chaos of the world. "Thank you," he said, his gaze meeting hers. It was the first time he had thanked her for anything, and the first time she felt she had truly earned it. The storm raged on through the night, but inside the house, something had shifted. The shared crisis had forged a new kind of bond between them, a partnership born of necessity and mutual reliance. The house was no longer just his house. It was their shelter. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, the world seemed washed clean. The air was crisp, and the land, revitalized by the rain, had taken on a deeper, richer color. The small, fenced-in patch of earth outside Evangeline's window, which she had tentatively begun to clear of stones and weeds, now seemed full of promise. She found a small cache of seeds in the larder, beans, squash, and hardy greens, and began to plant a garden. The act of pressing seeds into the damp soil was an act of faith, a quiet declaration that she intended to be here long enough to see them grow. It was a future measured not in years or marriages, but in seasons. She was kneeling in the dark earth one afternoon, her hands covered in dirt, when a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see Nate standing there, holding a newly mended hoe. He had replaced the cracked handle. He simply propped it against the fence post near her and walked away without a word. The gesture was a quiet endorsement of her efforts, an acknowledgement of her small claim on this place. Her past, however, was not so easily tilled under. A month after her arrival, Nate returned from a trip to Willow Creek with the mail. Among the letters for him was one for her, forwarded from Boston. It was from her sister, penned weeks ago in a world that no longer felt real. Evangeline took the letter to her room, her hands trembling. She sat on her bed, the patchwork quilt a comforting weight, and read her sister's cheerful, oblivious words about wedding preparations and the beautiful life that awaited her in the West. Each sentence was a small, sharp blade. The grief she had held at bay for so long finally broke through her defenses, and she wept. She cried not for Joshua, the man, for he had become a phantom, a symbol of deceit. She cried for the woman she had been, for her naive hopes and her shattered dreams. She cried for the profound, public shame of her abandonment. She mourned the loss of a future that had been a lie. She did not know how long Nate stood in the hallway outside her closed door. She only knew that when she finally emerged, her face swollen and her spirit scoured clean, he was sitting on the porch, staring out at the horizon. He did not look at her or mention the sounds of her sorrow he must have heard. He just shifted slightly on the bench, making room. She hesitated for a moment, then went and sat beside him. They sat in silence as the sun bled across the sky, a comfortable, shared quiet that was more comforting than any words could have been. In that moment, she realized her grief was no longer just about what she had lost. It was also a letting go, a painful but necessary shedding of a skin that no longer fit. The life she had wanted was gone, but the life she had, here on this rugged porch with this quiet, steady man, was real. It was hard, and it was spare, but it was honest. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The trip to Willow Creek was a necessity. Supplies were low, and Nate needed to speak with a man about selling some cattle. For Evangeline, It was a trial she had been dreading. To return to the town that had been the stage for her humiliation felt like willingly walking into a den of lions. But Nate had simply stated, "I'll need your help with a list," and she understood it was not a request. It was an expectation that she was part of this now, and hiding was not an option. As they rode the wagon into the small, dusty main street, she felt the stares. They were immediate and undisguised. Women paused in their shopping, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Men tipped their hats to Nate, but let their gazes linger on her, the jilted woman from the East, now living as a housekeeper for the solitary rancher. The whispers were like the rustle of dry leaves, just at the edge of hearing, but impossible to ignore. Evangeline kept her eyes fixed forward, her back ramrod straight, her gloved hands clenched tightly in her lap. She felt the hot blush of shame creep up her neck, a familiar, unwelcome heat. Inside the mercantile, the scrutiny was even more intense. Mrs. Cobb, the station master's wife and the town's primary purveyor of gossip, gave her a look that was a masterwork of condescending sympathy. "My dear Miss Hartwell," she said, her voice oozing false concern, "we were all so worried about you. It is a blessing that Mr. Garrison was able to find a place for you." The implication was clear. She was a fallen woman, an object of charity. Before Evangeline could form a reply, a man standing near the counter, a ranch hand she didn't know, snickered. "Found more than a place for her, I reckon." Garrison always was a quiet one inch. The insult was crude and unmistakable, a casual stain on both her honor and Nate's. The air in the store went still. Evangeline froze, the shame so acute it felt like a physical blow. Then Nate, who had been examining harnesses at the back of the store, moved. He did not rush. He did not raise his voice. He simply walked to the counter and placed himself between Evangeline and the other men. He set a heavy coil of rope on the counter with a solid thud that drew every eye. He looked directly at the man who had spoken, his gaze level and cold as a winter river. He said nothing. He simply held the man's stare, a silent, immovable wall of quiet authority. The man shuffled his feet, his smirk faltering. He looked away first, muttering something under his breath, before turning and practically fleeing the store. Nate then turned his attention to Mrs. Cobb, his expression unchanged. "We'll need 50 pounds of flour, 10 of coffee, and a box of cartridges for the Winchester," he said, his voice calm and even, as if nothing had happened. He had not started a fight. He had not uttered a threat. He had defended her with the sheer force of his character, a display of dignity so profound it silenced all opposition. He had publicly claimed her as being under his protection and worthy of his respect. As they loaded their supplies into the wagon, Evangeline felt a profound shift inside her. The shame that had clung to her like a shroud began to feel thin and insubstantial. She had been defended. She had been honored. She looked at Nate, at his strong, silent profile against the harsh sunlight, and for the first time, she did not see an employer or a rescuer. She saw a partner. The partnership that had been forged in crisis and tempered in the crucible of daily life deepened into something more profound. The silences between them were no longer just comfortable. They were communicative. A shared glance across the dinner table, a nod of understanding as they worked in tandem, a quiet moment on the porch watching the stars emerge. These became their conversations. The ranch, once a place of refuge, had become a home. Her home. The garden she had planted flourished under her care, its green shoots a vibrant testament to her own resilience. She found a quiet joy in the rhythm of the seasons, in the feel of the earth, in the simple satisfaction of a well-cooked meal. The woman who had arrived in a silk dress, full of illusions, was a distant memory. The woman she was now had calluses on her hands and dirt under her nails. She was stronger, quieter, and more deeply rooted than she had ever been. She had not found the life she had expected, but she had found herself. One evening in late summer, after a long day of haying, they sat on the porch as they often did. The air was warm and smelled of cut grass and dust. A chorus of crickets provided the evening's music. The silence stretched, comfortable and familiar. Evangeline was watching the last sliver of sun disappear behind the distant hills when Nate finally spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "The nights will be getting colder soon," he said, not looking at her, but the vast expanse of their land. "Winter is hard out here. It's better not to face it alone." She waited, her heart suddenly beating a little faster. This was more than just a comment on the weather. "This house," he continued, his gaze still fixed on the horizon, "it was just a place to sleep before. Now it feels right, with you in it." He finally turned to look at her, and in the dim light, she could see the earnestness, the quiet vulnerability in his eyes. It was a look she had never seen on his face before. "We work well together, Evangeline. We understand each other. It seems to me that this partnership, it is a good 1 inch." He took a breath, the simple sound seeming loud in the twilight stillness. "I'm not a man of fancy words, but I'm asking if you would consent to make this partnership a permanent one. I am asking you to be my wife." It was not a passionate, breathless declaration from a novel. It was something far more real and infinitely more precious. It was a proposal built on a foundation of shared hardship, mutual respect, and a love that had grown slowly and quietly, like a hardy prairie plant in tough soil. It was an offering of shared future, a life of work and quiet dignity, side by side. The tears that welled in her eyes were not tears of sorrow or shame, but of a deep, overflowing gratitude. She looked at this steady, honorable man, the anchor in the storm of her life, and her answer was as simple and true as his question. "Yes, Nate," she whispered. "Yes." They were married by a traveling circuit judge in the main room of the ranch house, the same room where they had first shared a silent, awkward meal. There were no guests, no flowers, no fine clothes. Evangeline wore a simple calico dress she had sewn herself. Nate wore a clean shirt. The only witnesses were the vast, silent land outside the window and the spirits of the house itself, which had seen them transform from strangers into partners. The judge's words were brief and formal, but they carried the weight of a covenant, a solemn promise made not in a crowded church, but in the heart of a life they were already building. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, Nate took her hand. His grasp was warm and firm, a silent affirmation of the bond between them. There was no grand celebration, only a shared meal at the table, now their table, and a sense of quiet, profound rightness that settled over the house like a soft blanket. Life continued, but it was irrevocably changed. The subtle line between employer and employee, between rescuer and rescued, dissolved completely. They were partners in every sense of the word. They worked the land together, fought against drought and early frost together, and celebrated small victories together. A healthy calf, a bountiful harvest from her garden, a winter storm weathered safely by the fire. Evangeline discovered new depths to the man she had married. She found a dry humor that emerged at unexpected moments, a deep well of tenderness for his animals, and an unwavering moral compass that guided his every action. He, in turn, saw her strength, her intelligence, and the resilient spirit that had taken root and blossomed in this harsh, beautiful land. Years passed. The ranch prospered under their joint care. The house expanded, a new room added to hold the laughter of the children who came to fill their lives. One evening, Evangeline stood on the porch, watching their son and daughter chase fireflies in the twilight. Nate came to stand beside her, his arms settling comfortably around her shoulders. The scent of her garden, rich and fertile, hung in the air. She looked out at the rolling hills, no longer an intimidating wilderness, but a beloved and familiar landscape. It was home. She thought of the woman who had arrived at Willow Creek Station all those years ago, her heart full of dreams of a different man and a different life. She felt a pang of sympathy for that naive, hopeful girl, but no regret. The path she had been forced upon, the one that had begun in heartbreak and desolation, had led her here. It had led her to a love more real and enduring than any she had ever imagined, a partnership forged not of promises, but of presence. The greatest tragedies, she had learned, sometimes held the seeds of the most profound blessings. The life she had lost was a phantom. The life she had found was solid, true, and magnificent in its simplicity.